I'm Helen. Thank you. I am Helen Prohl. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System, or CMTS. The CMTS was established by presidential directive in late 2004, chartered in 2005, and established in statute in December of 2012. The CMTS is a maritime policy coordinating committee chaired at the cabinet level by the Secretary of Transportation, with much of the day-to-day policy direction coming from a sub-cabinet coordinating board. The chair of the coordinating board rotates yearly between the Secretaries of Transportation, Defense, Commerce, and Homeland Security. The position is currently held by USDOT, and we're honored to have as our chair Ms. Lucinda Leslie, the Deputy Administrator of the Maritime Administration, and from January 2021 until yesterday was the Acting Administrator of MARAD. Her many years of experience on Capitol Hill brought her time and again to understand the value of maritime transportation and its many component parts. And we're grateful for the strong CMTS work plan under her term as our chair, which has included priority areas related to the enhancement of the MTS workforce, supporting safety and security of the system, ensuring unity of effort amongst the federal maritime-related or interested agencies, and requirements for an efficient maritime supply chain. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Lucinda Leslie for opening remarks. Ma'am, to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. I also welcome Chris Connor from American Association of Port Authorities, our distinguished guests, and everyone listening today as we discuss challenges to the resilience of the MTS. I also want to thank Helen for her leadership at the CMTS. I think Chase Long, and of course, American Association of Port Authorities for partnering with us as we observe Infrastructure Week. This discussion is timely and critical in large measure because this administration is leading historic investments to ensure that the infrastructure needs of tomorrow will be met by the construction we undertake now. Thanks to the president's historic bipartisan infrastructure law, we are poised to make significant progress in modernizing maritime infrastructure, upgrading infrastructure and ensuring equitable access to jobs, while also speeding cargo throughput. The president's bipartisan infrastructure law will invest $1.2 trillion in total in infrastructure across the nation. 17 billion of that will be in port infrastructure and waterway infrastructure to reduce our maintenance backlog, reduce congestion, strengthen our supply chains, and remove bottlenecks. Of that money, the Maritime Administration will administer $2.25 billion to be awarded over the next 5 years through our Port Infrastructure Development Program. As you may have seen, on February 23rd, Secretary Buttigieg announced the notice of funding opportunity for the first round of funding for the PIDP grants provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law. This first round totals $450 million, which is an investment that is almost double the amount provided last year for the PIDP grant program and is the largest single investment ever made in the program. On top of that funding, the appropriations measure that was just enacted by Congress, the first under President Biden, provides an additional $234 million for the PIDP program, bringing the total amount of funding available this year to $680 million, which far exceeds any previous investment in the PIDP program. This funding will support grants that will improve the movement of goods to, through, and around ports and help us cut emissions associated with port operations by boosting electrification and enabling investments in other low carbon technologies to reduce environmental impacts. In keeping with the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, applicants must also provide a plan explaining how proposed projects will address environmental justice impacts and advance equity in the workforce. Applications were actually due yesterday. I hope that many ports across the US took advantage of the opportunity to apply. And we look forward to making awards late summer, early fall, as quickly as possible. In addition to port infrastructure improvements, we're also dedicating new resources to benefit domestic shipping through the America's Marine Highway Program, which provides funding to our marine highways navigable rivers near coastal waterways, and our Great Lakes, among other waterways. In March of this year, the DOT announced the availability of nearly $25 million in grant funding for the Marine Highway Program. This too was the largest single investment in this particular program, and it was made available by the President's bipartisan infrastructure law. Here too, additional funding was also made available in the appropriations measure that was just enacted, and this brings the total amount of funding available for the program this year to just under $40 million. We have amended the notice of funding opportunity to include the additional funding made available through the appropriations measure, and the deadline for applications has been extended to June 17th. Put simply, President Biden is leading the largest ever federal investment in modernizing our ports and our domestic coastwise services, addressing supply chain resiliency and improving the lives of Americans who rely on our supply chains. This is truly an extraordinary moment, and it is my deepest honor to serve in the administration at this time. As Transportation Secretary Buttigieg has said, these are the kinds of investments that can help make sure a new generation of Americans can live and thrive in the communities where they were raised. These are the kinds of investments that America ought to have been making all along, but we're doing it now. And I am so proud of how communities that have already been working with generations old infrastructure have kept the fires lit and kept the communities going. We are now in the process of building the infrastructure that we need for our economy of the future. Our MARAD Gateway directors are continuing to meet with ports, localities, and regional planning agencies and coordinating to help them identify strategies to reduce emissions at ports. I encourage every port to make sure that you're in touch with your Gateway director so that you can be aware of the funding opportunities available through MARAD and through the federal government. MARAD is keen on supporting a coordinated approach regarding our infrastructure improvements. We also appreciate the CMTS for being so central to convening all of the entities that have equities in the marine environment. The marine transportation system is obviously MARAD's highest priority, but it's also a central priority for the Department of Transportation and central to the President's investments in our infrastructure. Our national mobility, our safety, our economic health, and our natural environment must all be shared priorities among federal, regional, and local agencies, as well as the many private sector owners and operators who are involved. And the Maritime Administration is here to provide support wherever we can. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Helen. And again, welcome Chris Connor to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Leslie. I want to thank you again for your leadership, strong leadership this last year with the CMTS. It's an absolute pleasure to work with you. It's my pleasure also to introduce Mr. Chris Connor. Chris is the CEO and president of the American Association of Port Authorities. He is the former global president and CEO of Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics. His extraordinary experience in maritime goes on for pages. But let me just note that it is no surprise that in 2013, he was named Logistician of the Year. Honored to have him provide opening remarks for us today. Thank you, Chris, to you.
Thank you, Helen, and good job on the pronunciation of Wilhelmsen.
Thank you.
His name.
I was hoping you noticed.
So well done. And Lucinda, let me just say to you, thanks for being where you were the last 12 or 15 months, actually, and keeping your hand so firmly on the wheel during this historic period. And I think I speak for everyone in the maritime industry that with this change, with Admiral Phillips coming in, delighted to see that you'll still be an integral role of the leadership team at MARAD. So thank you for everything.
Thank you so much. And it's been an honor to serve, and no one is happier than I am about Admiral Phillips' confirmation. Thank you.
I understand. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. It's my pleasure to be a part of it and to have a chance to offer some introductory remarks. At the risk of stating the obvious, supply chain disruption is still in the news big time. In boardrooms, classrooms, taverns, sports arenas, airports, golf courses, you name it, any place where Americans gather in person or virtually, supply chain challenges are still top of mind. Everyone wants to know, when is this going to be over? The answer is elusive at best, and at worst, laced with a host of complexities that are often brain-numbingly difficult. Supply chains clearly have the attention of the United States Congress. There are several pieces of legislation in various stages of development seeking to address some component or multiple components of the effects supply chain disruption and freight congestion are having on the U.S. economy broadly and on consumers, as well as U.S. exporters more specifically. Sorry, I'm scrolling here on a laptop I'm not familiar with. I've been involved in the freight movement industry since 1981. For most of those 41 years, my profession of choice was a relatively obscure fact for friends and other acquaintances. Interesting dinner party conversation was always the domain of the doctor, the lawyer, the hedge fund trader, but never the freight guy. Now, everyone wants to talk about the supply chain and freight movement. Seriously, thinking back over the last generation or so, if the goods we consumers wanted were available, when and where we wanted them, there just wasn't a lot of noise or public outcry about ports, rails, truck, warehouses, or any other part of the global supply chain. Industry insiders certainly understood the vulnerabilities and the systemic problems within the different freight modes, as well as the black holes that exist in information sharing between modes. But pre-pandemic, our freight network was, while flawed, highly functional. The pandemic radically altered the landscape and laid bare the shortcomings of our freight network and put a very bright spotlight on decades-long underinvestment in port infrastructure and intermodal connectivity. We all know the consequences as they played out in real time over many months. But from the depths of those challenges, hope has emerged in a multitude of forms, including, and as has been referred to by Lucinda, historic funding levels for port-only federal grant programs, most notably PIDP. There's also stepped up funding for multimodal federal grant programs, giving ports a shot at more federal money, albeit in competition with other modalities. We're witnessing an evolving esprit de corps among supply chain participants, enabling greater collaboration and resulting in historic volumes of freight moving through ports to store shelves in what the NRF, the National Retailers Federation, called the most successful holiday sales season ever in 2021. There's also a growing recognition by this administration and by Congress that our nation's ports are indeed strategic geopolitical assets and should be viewed as and invested in accordingly. We're experiencing increase of hours of operation up to 24/7 at our nation's largest port complex. Incentive and rebate schemes have been established at select marine terminals and rail depots to incentivize cargo owners to pick up freight during the now extended operating hours. New tariffs have been threatened to incentivize cargo owners or their agents to clear cargo off marine terminals within prescribed frameworks. Encouragingly, we've seen the development of pop-up container yards at off-port locations, enabling bulk movement of inbound containers to yards with greater intermodal connectivity and far less congestion. We've also seen the creation of special on-port export receiving yards, aided by Department of Agricultural funding, to help give advantage to U.S. exports in overseas markets. And finally, the launch of a pilot program called FLOW, Freight Logistics Optimization Works, designed to help create a connected supply chain. Because while the global supply chain is clearly interdependent, it is not interconnected, and it should be. These 10 developments and more are in play, and ports, ladies and gentlemen, now have a seat at the adult table in the national freight mobility conversation, and as a result, are in a much better position to enhance critical port infrastructure and intermodal connectivity. With domestic freight activity expected to increase by 50% by the year 2050, according to a recently released study by DOT's Bureau of Transportation Statistics. All of this comes not a moment too soon. While much of the focus has been on container ports, this is about so much more. It's about ports of all shapes and sizes, catering to different freight markets and residing in communities up and down our coast, the Great Lakes, and on rivers that connect our hinterlands to markets overseas. So, are we all good? Disaster averted? Back to normal? I don't think so, and neither, I'm quite sure, does anyone in this webinar today. The threat of supply chain disruption will be ever present unless and until we as a nation make a sustained commitment to invest in port infrastructure and intermodal connectivity. It's time that we recognize that our freight mobility network as a national economic treasure and invest accordingly as global competitors such as China already do. The IIJA, signed into law by the president on November 15th last year, is a great first step and includes significant funding opportunities for ports at historic levels. But the funding only runs for 5 years, and we need to think much longer term and far more strategically to prepare for the next generation and the generations that follow. So all this attention on the supply chain is, in my view, a good thing. It's a chance to tell our story against the backdrop of decades of underinvestment in our port and intermodal connectivity system. Eventually, the current situation will fade from the news cycle, but it's imperative that our industry stays relentless and laser focused on informing lawmakers on the long-term strategic importance of the U.S. port system and the need for sustained investments. In closing, let me summarize by zooming in on the following points. The Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act is a big victory for the port industry and for America's freight transportation system. It's the kind of investment in infrastructure that we've needed for a generation. Ports will be receiving billions of dollars over the next 5 years. I sincerely hope that ports won't be forgotten compared to other modes of transportation. Ports are America's gateways, and they have been underfunded and neglected for too long. I hope that Congress won't forget about infrastructure needs now that we've passed the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. I sincerely hope that the supply chain crisis has galvanized the public and policymakers to the reality that infrastructure investment is integral to a thriving economy. New construction can, and in some cases does, last decades. So we should invest in projects that will prepare ports for cargo levels that will only continue to rise in the decades to come. We also have the potential to reshore industries that we've lost and create totally new economic industries and opportunities in the U.S. Worldwide demand for clean energy and energy security will be among the greatest challenges of the 21st century. And finally, ports will play a critical role in the export of energy and the transition to electric equipment and alternative fuels. Thank you to Helen, Lucinda, and all the hardworking staff at the CMTS and MARAD. I'm looking forward to a great panel discussion today.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for Ms. Leslie and Chris for your incredible and insightful remarks as we begin this conversation. We have 4 distinguished panelists who will provide different but interlinked perspectives on transportation and maritime transportation, current and future funding requirements. I will introduce each panelist, after which each will provide a short 5 to 10 minute overview. After they've provided their overviews, I will begin a question and answer session. Before the end of that session, and time permitting, we will take questions from attendees. The chat function is already open to enter any questions you may have at any time during this conversation. We'll also provide an opportunity for attendees online and on the phone to ask questions. We sincerely appreciate if you would also identify yourself before asking your question. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the CMTS YouTube channel, the link of which will be provided on the CMTS website at www.cmts.gov. And let me just ask quickly, did I forget anything about formats and presentation today before I begin?
No, Helen, everything is good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. So also, folks, Chase Long, who is joining us today, is our logistics manager for the webinar. And since the chat is available, if you have any questions or comments, please just chat in, and I'm sure he'll be sure to answer anything you might have. So we have with us today Dr. Joseph Schofer. He is Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Robert R. McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science at Northwestern University. His research interests are in policy planning, analysis, evaluation, and decision support for transportation and other infrastructure systems, including effective use of data and information, and learning from natural experiments. He is actively engaged with the Transportation Research Board, currently chairing the TRB Standing Committee on Data for Decision Making. He chaired the recently completed congressionally mandated Transportation Research Board consensus study on investing in transportation resilience, a framework for informed sources. Our second panelist is Ms. Deb DeLuca. She is the Executive Director of the Port Authority of Duluth Seaway Port Authority and the first woman to lead the organization in its history. She formerly served as Government and Environmental Affairs for the Port Authority and as a principal of DeLuca Strategies for 14 years prior to joining the Port Authority, with previous experience in public and private sectors. She is currently president of the Minnesota Ports Association, treasurer of the American Great Lakes Ports Association, chair of the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee, and an executive committee member of APEX, a regional economic and business development organization. Our third panelist is Dr. Darren Timothy. Dr. Timothy has served as the chief economist of the U.S. Department of Transportation since 2017, and also a previous panelist on these panels with the AAPA. In this capacity, he leads the department's efforts to apply economic principles and methods in analysis of policies, programs, projects, and regulations produced at the department and its operating administrations. His office also has responsibility for multimodal freight policy within USDOT. He serves as the chair of the Transportation Research Board Committee on Economic and Finance. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Matt Wartian. He serves as Burns and McDonnell's Port and Maritime National Business Development Manager. In this role, he's responsible for developing and implementing the strategy to grow the company's planning, design, construction, and consulting services to U.S. ports and terminals. He specializes in leading multidisciplinary teams, sounds like the CMTS, to deliver innovative projects that improve port and terminal sustainability and resiliency. He's been providing consulting services to ports for over 15 years on issues ranging from natural resources to zero emissions and goods movement. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Joseph Schofer to provide his short overview. Sir?
Thank you, Helen, and you reminded me short overview. We'll focus on short. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with and work with this distinguished panel and to work with all of you in the middle of Infrastructure Week. Ports in the MTS are integral parts of a broader multimodal logistics system, the success of which depends on interconnected performance. The bipartisan infrastructure law presents a unique opportunity to restore and to advance our ports and maritime infrastructure. And as we consider where we should invest to maximize long-term value under the bill, it would be important to stay focused on the objectives and the measures of performance of the MTS. How are we doing, and where do we need to do better? Of course, each facility presents its own unique needs and opportunities, assuring a state of good repair, addressing congestion, accommodating larger ships, handling new and different cargoes. The COVID-19 supply chain meltdown, if I can call it that, which began in the early spring of 2020 and is with us today, it puts the word supply chain in the American vernacular. Chris reminded us of that, and it's with us on a daily basis. And it's true that now I have something to say at cocktail parties, although I haven't been going to cocktail parties. It put the COVID-19 meltdown put the spotlight on transportation capacity, particularly port capacity for container freight. And what we learned that supply chains are complex multiplayer processes. And I've tried to illustrate that in this slide. So I will not walk you through the slide. You can look at it while I proceed with my remarks. But the message here is that this process is really complicated. There are a lot of players involved. The players have their own motivations, and making this work as a system as well as we have itself is very impressive, and making it work better is a particular challenge. While the focus of a lot of the concern has been on port congestion, and I checked the data this morning and learned that there were 69,000 import containers sitting in the Port of Los Angeles, more than a quarter of which have been there for more than 9 days. We learned in the studies that we've done of the impact of COVID-19 that there are multiple choke points in the systems, and it's not just the ports. And they're listed here, and I'll quickly just remind you that what we're looking at is, and what we continue to look at, is shortages in labor across the supply chain, and the ports, the railroads, trucking, and surprisingly in warehousing and retail stores. Shortages of containers because they're not coming back as fast as you might expect or we might want. Shortages of chassis, something we don't think about all that much, but chassis are essential to carry the boxes, and their allocation problems, and also some evidence of hoarding where people are holding back on this resource, on the possibility they may need it in the near future. The particular shortage that I want to focus on is a shortage in capacity for storage. Not just at the ports, but especially inland, again, driven by labor shortages and the use of containers to hold inventory, and not just to temporarily hold them as they're in motion. You may remember in the summer of 2021, both the BNSF and the UP Railroad stopped or metered container flow from West Coast ports to the Chicago area because their Midwest yards were full. This model of the supply chain for containerized imports highlights multi-component process, a multi-actor process. It reminds us of the complexity and the challenge of finding the levers to make it work better. This suggests to me that one needs to use some caution in relating the addition of port capacity to increasing port throughput, because the product seems to be piling up at the front door. It's not moving out of the ports. And in particular, I think it's important to look at this overall supply chain from the point of view that we're not going to solve the problem with increasing storage in the ports unless we can move product out of the ports at a rate approximately equal to the rate at which it's coming in. It's going to be important as we think about how we deploy resources, how we make investments, to think in terms of benefits and costs. Benefit cost analysis provides, in the most general sense, provides a familiar and a useful framework for evaluating investment options. We can direct investment decisions by identifying and evaluating the benefits we expect investment projects to deliver. What are those benefits? Well, thinking specifically about ports and the MTS, a primary benefit is advancing the infrastructure to a state of good repair. And what's the value of that? The value of that is it's going to produce future cost savings, it's going to improve port performance, and it's going to increase reliability and resilience. The second benefit that we can quantify is increasing capacity where there's a need and where there's an opportunity, not only to move product through the ports, but also to increase the competitiveness of the marine highway for efficiency and sustainability. The third benefit is increasing safety and security. I think that's obvious to people. We're thinking about safety and security of both people and cargo. A fourth benefit is increasing resilience, which has moved into the spotlight in the last decade or so. Resilience of ports and the MTS to avoid future costs from damage and disruption, considering the growing natural hazard risks that we face, determined and this includes climate change and sea level rise, the vulnerability of key assets determined by their exposure to these natural assaults, by their design, by their condition, in some cases by their age, and also by asset criticality or value. What's the contribution of each of the assets in which we might invest? to the functionality of the port and the MTS, and to the performance of the entire U.S. logistics system. And the final benefit is sustainability, and that should be obvious to us as well. Sustainability to ensure the future by careful management of today's critical resources, energy and the environment and people. Sustainability benefits from ports and the MTS may also come from gaining market share against other more impactful surface modes. You know, there's another element to sustainability that we don't want to forget. The Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act is only the beginning. We need to secure the resources to maintain the momentum, to protect the performance of the MTS for the long run, so we don't fall behind again. I think one of the miracles of this particular bill was that it's going to change the state of the infrastructure world. And as we look at that, the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we get into this situation and how can we avoid it in the future? We're facing a unique opportunity to make balanced, cost-effective investments in ports and the MTS to guarantee the performance of our national logistics system. We should use that opportunity strategically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schofer. Our next panelist is Deb DeLuca from the Port Authority of Duluth. Ma'am, to you.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. I'm very proud. I should repeat that I'm the Executive Director of the Duluth Seaway Port Authority. I'm proud to be here as a voice for port authorities nationwide, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to celebrate and commemorate Infrastructure Week. I want to provide you a bit of context about the work we do as port authorities and about the port that I represent to set the stage for comments on the importance of infrastructure. Each port is unique in terms of the services that we offer and the cargoes that we move. But what is entirely consistent between ports and port authorities is that we connect our regional economies to domestic and global trade. 90% of all goods traded internationally are transported by water, which means they pass through multiple ports. Ports are not just integral then to our nation's economy, but they are lifelines to our regional economies as well. The Port of Duluth Superior, I'm going to tell you a little bit again about our port, and I see that, thank you, Chase, for the slide. Just to, for those of you who are from the coast and don't think about the middle of the continent, the Port of Duluth Superior is the furthest inland deep sea shipping port in the United States. We anchor the western terminus of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system, and we are the largest U.S. port on the Great Lakes by tonnage. We're consistently amongst the top 20 in the nation by tonnage as well. That's really remarkable when you consider that we're located very near to the midpoint of the geographic center of the North American continent. We are perfectly located to serve as a portal for raw materials and finished goods into and out of that North American heartland. Within our harbor, there are 21 terminals. They're distributed between the Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin shorelines. It's a two-city port. And the port is a major economic driver for our region. It represents every year 1.4 billion in economic activity and nearly 8,000 jobs regionally. The cargoes that generally move through our port are non-hazardous natural resources, commodities that move in bulk. You can consider these the raw materials of your everyday life. Number one through our port is iron ore, and I'm going to make a couple comments on that, but that makes up 55% of that tonnage, which is our total tonnage through the port is 35 million tons about each year. So number one is iron ore, then coal. Grain is our number one export. We also, there's limestone, salt, cement, and many specialty cargoes as well, including the general cargoes that move through our terminal. I want to comment on the iron ore because I think it illustrates the importance of ports and supply chains. 80% of the iron ore that goes into domestic first pour steel making in our nation comes from Minnesota's Iron Range. It passes through one of 3 ports on Lake Superior on its way to the steel making facilities on the lower Great Lakes. This is a critical industry to our nation. There was a Department of Homeland Security study that was done in 2015 that showed if this was disrupted for 6 months, the ensuing recession would be worse than the 2008 recession, with a loss of 11 million jobs that would be distributed nationwide. So our port is part of a critical supply chain, which by the way, wasn't broken during the pandemic, but so are all of the other ports. Each port is connected to critical supply chains that our nation relies upon. Now, getting to what we do as the Port Authority, the Duluth Seaway Port Authority owns and operates the one general cargo, break bulk cargo, project cargo terminal in the harbor. From a maritime perspective, what we move is these large pieces of equipment and machinery that have to be lifted with cranes and forklifts and other lift equipment. In general, this equipment supports mining, manufacturing, power generation, and wind energy industries. Notably, we are the #1 Great Lakes terminal for wind energy equipment on the Great Lakes. However, we're not just a maritime terminal. We operate our terminal as a multimodal logistics hub. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have 430,000 square feet of warehouse space that we're adding 56,000 square feet more this summer. Thank you, PIDP grants. We have 40 acres of outdoor storage space. We're served directly at our terminal by 4 Class 1 railroads, which means competitive rail rates. Of course, we have on-dock rail. We also have access to free-flowing, uncongested highways, including the USMCA corridor highway I-35 that runs from Canada down into Mexico. And it's only about less than half a mile. Access is only about a half mile from our terminal, actually less. And we also have the only intermodal facility for road and rail in Minnesota outside of the Twin Cities. And then just this year, we completed the Customs and Border Protection facility that's necessary for us to have the capability to move containers on water as well. That makes us only the 2nd Great Lakes port to have that capability. So what's unique about our terminal, or what our hallmark, is that our excellent terminal operator can shift seamlessly between modes. And our objective in operating this terminal is to provide the best supply chain solutions for our regional industries in order to keep them competitive in the global marketplace. Ask me for examples at question and answer if you want. But the point I want you to take away from this is that our port and other ports around the world, we move freight with an eye towards developing and supporting our regional economies. An efficient port with robust cargo transportation capacity is an invaluable resource. It attracts businesses and manufacturers who are then able to create, because they're able to create supply chains that they know that they'll have the reliable access to transportation that they need. And then in turn, they create jobs for the region. Now, turning back to our facility, our terminal is like a small city. You know, we have lots of infrastructure to maintain, and that's just maintenance: dock walls, roads, rails, warehouses, electricity, water, stormwater, all of it. And this all costs a lot of money. Our terminal is very representative of port terminals throughout the country. It's 60 years old. Infrastructure at some of our surrounding terminals is closer to 100 years old. It's at the end of its useful life. So we've invested $45 million in our terminal since 2015. We have plans to spend a minimum of another $25 million through 2025. And we're always looking to, how can we grow and expand this terminal to best suit the cargoes that we want to move through the terminal, and to best suit our regional economies, our regional industries, excuse me. All 4 ports, as Chris has mentioned, have faced challenges over this past 2 years of disrupted supply chain. For some, there have also been opportunities presented, but every port has its own unique set of challenges and opportunities, and resultantly, there is no silver bullet to untangle supply chain congestion. We each have unique infrastructure needs, but in general, if you're going to generalize, to build infrastructure that will last decades to come for port success into the future, we all need well-maintained dredged harbors. Some need deeper harbors and wider channels. We need bigger storage yards and more warehouse space. We need more lift equipment like cranes and other cargo handling equipment. We need excellent landside connections to road and rail. And we need a robust workforce to staff all of that: ships, ports, trucks, rail, etc. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will be a boon to our industry. There's no doubt about it, providing billions of dollars in infrastructure that's been neglected for decades. But when that funding is all spent in 5 years, we can't just forget about transportation infrastructure, just as Chris and Joseph said. Specifically, we need dedicated action. We need planning and funding that extends well beyond 5 years. We need to acknowledge the importance of infrastructure to our nation's sustainability and economic health. We need to immediately go to work, all of us, on identifying a sustainable source of infrastructure funding into the future, because I guarantee you that's going to take more than 5 years to figure that out. Maintaining a first-rate supply chain requires stability and predictability. For ports and private companies that we work with, knowing that funding will be available and also knowing what policies will govern freight movement is critical to planning for these facilities and supply chain planning. It's critical to making sound business decisions and attracting private investment. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I want to say thank you to the Committee on Marine Transportation. Thank you to MARAD, and thank you to American Association of Port Authorities for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Ms. DeLuca. Our next panelist is Dr. Darren Timothy from USDOT. Darren?
Thank you, Helen. Thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all and learn from our discussion. So at the U.S. Department of Transportation, we, of course, play a variety of roles in the marine transportation system. We host Helen and we're here at our building. We also have traditionally played roles as Lucinda referred to earlier through the Maritime Administration, and we've increasingly been playing a larger role in funding improvements, particularly on the land side of our ports in recent years. The Port Infrastructure Development Program was something that originally the appropriations committees provided funding based on some provisions in the maritime program. That's been upgraded over time through various National Defense Authorization Acts to be a real robust, dedicated program for port infrastructure. But we also have our other infrastructure programs that we've been dating back to the Tiger Grant program, funded originally under the American Recovery Act and Reinvestment Act, which has provided funding in smaller increments, but much of that funding has gone for port investments. Now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have this opportunity to really ramp up our efforts. And I think opportunities to do things that may have been more difficult at the lower levels of funding, to be able to take on some of the larger investments, while also or participating in those larger investments, while also ensuring that adequate funding is provided to facilities across the country, all of which, of course, have their own infrastructure investment needs. As Chris and others have alluded to, and Dr. Schofer talked about, our current supply chain crisis that we've been in the midst of in recent years has really pointed out both the importance of the marine transportation system, as well as the challenges we face in resilience. And in February of this year, the department, we released our supply chain assessment of the transportation industrial base. These reports that were called for in a presidential executive order the year before. One of those, there were reports required from various federal agencies, but most of the others focused on industrial production. When we thought about what we could do, what would be the most appropriate focus for the Department of Transportation, it was agreed that we would focus on the freight and logistics system, that aspect of the supply chain. As we developed that report, we had plenty of examples, current, ongoing, real, tangible examples to draw on of the challenges we face to resilience. And the within that report, we identified 62 recommendations aimed at really targeting, while the department has been engaged with other federal agencies on targeting through the supply chain disruptions task force, targeting some of these near-term solutions. We also wanted to take a longer look, thinking about over the medium and longer term, what are things that the federal government could be doing to support, improve the resilience of our transportation system. And we broke those recommendations up into 5 broad areas based on different federal policy roles. And the first of those, of course, was infrastructure investment. Our first recommendation involved using the funds provided under bipartisan infrastructure law to invest in projects that support supply chain resilience, promote domestic manufacturing, plan for future growth, and address intermodal and inland storage capacity needs, while simultaneously reducing environmental justice issues that freight infrastructure may create on just adjacent communities. So just simple task, obviously, that should be easy to do all at once. Or not really. But we are excited about these opportunities. Again, with increased funding, we have of course, obviously, the Port Infrastructure Development Program, as mentioned earlier, that's dedicated to these types of needs, where we have opportunities to invest throughout the transportation system, as has been discussed. Often the bottlenecks, ensuring that our investments that help address bottlenecks in one place don't just create another bottleneck down the line. Ports where we talk a lot about intermodal transfer facilities and those being bottlenecks or pinch points in the transportation system. Ports are in many ways the original intermodal transportation facilities. They've been around for millennia, long before anybody ever thought of using that as a generic term. And they've been serving the needs of commerce back to the earliest civilizations in the Nile and Nile River Valley and ancient Mesopotamia, helping to move goods and connect people, and even moving stones for the Egyptian pyramids. And so it's a longstanding challenge we have to move goods via water and connect them to people on land. But there are a lot of exciting opportunities as we move forward in the future. And I'll just note thinking about the types of investments that are needed. It's really interesting in seeing the types of projects that come in, applied for funding, just the variety of different problems that our local port operators and as well as operators on the inland waterway system are able to are facing. Sometimes it's issues that have they're operating at a very broad scale, really dealing with things that affect the entire nation. Other times it may be a really localized issue. It may be improving rail access to a river port that's designed to support the movement of a handful of commodities. But those investments can really have a significant impact on those local economies, really being able to connect them to the rest of the country and the world. With these, another aspect, of course, of the marine transportation system is at the federal level, is the diverse distributed responsibilities as Congress has organized. And that's, of course, one of the key purposes of the CMTS to help bring those agencies together so that we're working collaboratively with one another. This is definitely something we see on the infrastructure investment side. We see many applications for projects involved designed to increase capacity at ports, where they're referencing investments being made by the Corps of Engineers on the water side, and that in order to really achieve the benefits of either of those, you need both those investments. You need the deeper and wider channels to be able to accommodate larger ships, but if you don't have the complementary investments on the port side, you're unlikely to fully realize those opportunities. And so I think having that greater degree of collaboration among federal government entities is critical. Investments, we also talk about investments in mitigating the impacts of freight movement. That could be real critical. Sometimes we see those as simply investments in mitigation per se, but absent those investments, there are limits to what we can do on the freight and goods movement side. We live in a democratic society, and it's important that we consider the needs of all of our citizens. And by mitigating those impacts, we can provide greater opportunities both for our economy and make it possible to improve the transportation system. So the final point I'll make is that as we began providing funding for federal funding for marine transportation improvements, the federal funding always comes with certain strings attached to it. These strings are designed to promote important federal policies, such as Buy America provisions. And one thing in the early days when the funding we were providing funding in relatively small amounts, as we look for opportunities to provide that funding for American-made goods. One of the things we would often hear is that the federal funding was such a small piece of the overall investment market that it was unlikely to have an impact on the location of manufacturing of certain types of equipment or other key components. I think one of the things we're looking to do, and as obviously one of the president's top priorities, is as we have this increased funding, revisiting some of that. And I think one of the questions we have, where are those opportunities with significant federal funding going towards some of these types of investments that we really could reestablish a domestic supply base for some of these types of equipment. And again, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all and look forward to taking questions.
Thank you so much, Darren. Our final panelist to provide a short overview is Dr. Matt Mortian. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Helen. And thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak to you. And first, I want to thank the CMTS and the AAPA. From my perspective today, what I'll be doing is giving you insights on how an engineering construction firm as a service provider to ports and terminals is supporting the infrastructure investments provided by the Biden administration. So for those of you that don't know Burns & McDonnell, we are a company founded in 1898 in Kansas City, Missouri. We are a family of companies that plan, design, and construct our nation's infrastructure. We're an employee-owned company, and our mission is to improve the quality of life while making our clients successful. And in the ports and maritime space, we focus on helping our clients integrate electrification, and distributed generation into their infrastructure to enhance their operational sustainability as well as resilience. So it seems like it's very well aligned with the goals of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. As many of my fellow panelists, and one of the benefits of going last is that on such a great panel is that so many folks have covered the key points to begin with. But I'll just reiterate a couple things today about our marine transportation system, the supply chain issues, and then really the different take that I'll bring to this discussion will be getting prepared for the grants fund, some key lessons learned that we've gained from work with ports across the country. And then lastly, as it relates to the benefit cost analysis, two areas that we think that are absolutely critical for successful applications and that we're seeing seem to be well aligned with the funding goals focus for ports as well as broadly within the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So first off, on the marine transportation system, as all of you know who are listening in, our MTS is expansive. It covers 25,000 miles of navigable channels. It includes 3,500 terminals in the United States alone. And if anyone didn't know prior to this last year in the wake of COVID and the supply chain disruptions, it's absolutely critical to our day-to-day life as well as to the safety and security of our overall economy. As the ports and maritime goods movement, moves trillions of dollars of goods a year and contributes over 500 billion to our national GDP. So ensuring the safety and security and efficiency of our MTS while protecting the environment as well as the local communities is critical to avoiding supply chain disruptions in the future. As Chris spoke as well as Dr. Schofer and Dr. Timothy and Deb, we all highlighted the increased awareness of the overall communities on the supply chain disruptions and its effect to day-to-day life. And also that supply chain disruptions that we saw and the overall community saw, it really opened the door for people to be aware of the importance of ports in our overall economy and our lives. I live, as you see my backdrop, just in San Diego. You see the Port of San Diego behind me. And even at the Port of San Diego, Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, on the West Coast there, you see the supply chain disruptions, stalling the movement of goods. And really with that, it identified the need not only to invest in our largest ports, but also to diversify our investments across the country, including our inland waterways, to think about the overall diversity and resiliency of goods movement to all our different transportation hubs across the country. So with that said, on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, obviously we all know that there's 1.2 trillion with 17 billion earmarked for ports. But what I think is really interesting, and Chris Connor touched on it briefly, is the over $30 billion in funding for which ports are eligible for over and above the 17 billion. Funding like $7 billion in funding through the Protect program, the $2.5 billion for the charging and fueling infrastructure, the $6.4 billion for carbon reduction programs, and then the $7.5 billion for the RAISE program, as Dr. Timothy talked about. And so along with all that funding, I think the key thing for all of us to keep in mind is what is the priority, and how do we get prepared for the grant applications that we'll be doing for the next 5 years as we attempt to secure funds to improve all of our investment, all of our infrastructure. And so what we're seeing a lot of our clients do, they're trying to get ahead of that, and that have been getting ahead of this for the last several years, is number one, moving forward with updating your master plans, making sure that you have clarity about what projects are right for you, what will actually enhance your operations for the future. Number two is conducting resiliency and decarbonization assessments, recognizing that the goal of infrastructure investment is to improve our supply chain and reduce bottlenecks while also reducing emissions. That's absolutely critical. And then performing engineering and construction feasibility assessments that allow you to get better clarity of your project descriptions, as well as your rough order of magnitude costing for projects. And of course, no project can ever be done on an island. And so engaging the local project partners, whether it's the terminal operators, if you're a terminal operator, the port authorities, your service providers, as well as the stakeholders in surrounding community, those environmental justice groups and things of that nature, who are absolutely critical to successful projects and reducing roadblocks during implementation. And then lastly, identifying how the project will benefit the economy, environment, and as well as the overall community, as Dr. Schofer talked about, that benefit cost analysis. And there's two areas that I really want to focus on as we're thinking about moving forward. The first is resiliency, and that relates to designing for sea level rise, as well as designing for future levels of perturbation and natural disasters and storm events, rather than just based on the past. We see the U.S. Navy, where we're designing a lot of dry docks, they're absolutely thinking about the future rather than the past. And if we're going to ensure our supply chains, we need to do the same. And then the other area is really related to sustainability and decarbonization. So, ports are, of course, important to our overall economy, but there are environmental impacts through the course of emissions, both greenhouse gases as well as criteria pollutants. And so transitioning the way we move goods for efficiency as well as for lower emissions through electrification and incorporation of zero and non-zero goods moving equipment is critical. While we do that, it does make us more susceptible to potential implications related to disruptions in our utility feeds because we're more dependent upon electricity from the local grids. And so therefore, there's the opportunity to incorporate more distributed generation like on-site renewables, solar, battery storage, potentially wind, more space allows, and on tops of rooftops that allow us to reduce our carbon footprints while at the same time increase our resilience of our operations. So my closing points for my opening statement is just that right now we are at an unprecedented level of infrastructure funding. We're on the precipice of it. It's a once in a lifetime level if we look at the past. Hopefully it'll continue to the future. But as we move forward into this world in the next 5 years and 10 years, we really need to be thinking about the future, not the past, in terms of what we're investing in. We need to focus on reducing our environmental impacts for the benefit of the community, as well as the environment, but also for the ports itself, because it's only through that mode of operation that will continue to grow. And then lastly, any investments we're making is really not a one-time investment, as we all know. It's just laying the groundwork for future investments that are necessary to increase our preeminence in the overall supply chain. And with that, I thank you and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to all our presenters for providing that really great overview. So I'm going to begin the conversation as I chatted in. If you have a question and we have time for it, please go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll make sure that we take a look, and we certainly want to do as much as we can to give time for you to have a question answered. So Chris Connor noted that the recent funding is a big victory for ports, and clearly it is towards physical infrastructure at ports, which was referenced by Mr. Luca. Now, you've all noted that the marine transportation system is a system, right? There are many component parts. You can see the slide by Dr. Schofer. It was talked about by all of you. There's ocean carriers, and I'll add there's coastal, Great Lakes, and inland carriers. There's navigation channels, there's buoys, there's warehouses, distribution centers, multimodal transportation components. As DeLuca even referenced to Customs and Border Protection, there's only one of many support services, including labor and pilots for the MTS and ports. And Darren's referenced them as really complementary investments. Matt even noted that there's 2,500 terminals in the system. So my first question to panelists is whether we think of them as funding gaps or essential support functions that fall through the cracks. And limiting your respective responses to a couple of minutes each, are there any components in the MTS that are left behind in this extraordinary funding? Go first to Dr. Schofield, and of course, if you feel like you need to pass, feel free to pass. Sir?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm the right starting point, because my sense is that, and my perspective is that I want to be looking at the overall logistics system, and there are pieces of that are not related to infrastructure that need tending and that need improvement. So this particular bill, as important as it is is not going to address that. As I was listening to the other speakers, I was trying to write down a list of, so what do we do next? And there's a lot of what we do next is infrastructure, but plenty is not. It's bringing people together. It's bringing employees back to the system. It's assuring that working conditions are suitable so that people want to have these high paying jobs. And some of that is yeah, the issue is that there may not be all the levers that we want to make this work.
Thank you. Mr. Luca?
I think I'll be a contrarian and answer your question, address it slightly differently. It's not so much, I guess I would ask of all of us to think about in finding our solutions for, kind of in a rush to fix what's wrong at individual ports, providing more laydown space at coastal ports. At what point are we encouraging more of the same? Are we just growing? Are we already, in other words, are we already operating at the margins of efficiency at some of these locations, and in the way we're conducting our supply chains? And this kind of gets back to something that I think I heard Dr. Darren and Chris both reference. We really do need to reshore some of critical industries and bring some manufacturing back into this country. That also uses our supply chains internally, and some of that can go for export as well. So I think from what I've looked at all the grant programs, I'm excited about what's there to fix what's wrong with our terminals. But I don't see anyone looking at, I see it given lip service, but I don't see a lot of effort going into how do we bring more manufacturing, how do we resource some of those critical industries? And I'll tell you another thing, I don't know how I'm very excited about decarbonization and electrifying the electrification of our port terminals and our equipment, but I don't know that we're moving quickly enough on building out the grid infrastructure to support that. And I don't see a lot of movement on that either.
Thank you. Manufacturing is definitely a support industry for sure. Thank you. Darren, how about you?
Obviously, it's hard to lick a $1.2 trillion gift horse in the mouth, but as we endeavored to wrap our arms around it at the U.S. Department of Transportation, sometimes it's hard to imagine wanting more, at least in the moment. But I think looking back at the President's original American Jobs Plan proposal, it did have a $6 billion proposal for a Healthy Ports Initiative, focusing, I think, on mitigating the impacts of air pollution in neighborhoods around our ports. And I think some of while support for those types of investments is definitely there, obviously the president's proposal would have expanded those resources much more significantly to really try and electrify our ports and reduce those local emissions, which I've seen recent research suggesting that those impacts can be even greater than one expected. Looking at the increases in hospitalizations for respiratory illnesses in communities around ports when ships are actually there versus times when they aren't. And so I think there's still some real opportunities going forward for those types of investments, and in addition to the ones that we're seeing made.
Yeah, thank you. A great case for thinking of the system as a system and that everything is intertwined. Matt, how about you?
I think the $1.2 million is a tremendous start. But when you look at the level of infrastructure investment that's going to be needed to really enhance the supply chain efficiency and better integrate, I think the key aspect that may be missing is that when you look at how the money is allocated and who's administering the money, there needs to be better cohesion and collaboration about how the money is spent. So, for example, if you're investing in charging infrastructure for cargo heavy equipment at a port, it does you very little good if the local utility doesn't have funds to bolster their local energy supply and prepare for electrification. Similarly, if you're building out your infrastructure thinking only about maximizing your throughput for today and not thinking about how to balancing out import export. There's multiple different entities that need to be working together to really make sure we're maximizing this funding, thinking about the major goals. And obviously that's challenging, but I think that would be how we widely use the money in the future. Helen, we lost your audio.
No, didn't lose it. Just didn't put it back on. Thank you. Any panelists want to add anything to their remarks on that question? Okay, thank you. Matt, you highlighted tending to coastal resilience, and as any good coastal engineer should. And this is to all of you, but will the investments of today, you think, meet the future climate change challenges of the future? So specifically, Deb, is the Port of Duluth, really building back better, or are the investments really thinking about that? Is it? And Matt, what's your perspective? And of course, any panelist can respond. Thank you.
So let Matt go first as the engineer.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks, Deb. So I think there's a couple ways that ports are really thinking about for the future. The first way that we're seeing is that, like you said, in the case of sea level rise, as well as increasing storm surge and increased frequencies of hurricane events in certain parts of the country, as well as freezes and fires, what you see is that there's a change in how infrastructure is being built. It's no longer being built for the past frequency and temperature variations in the past. The nice thing also in terms of sea level rise is this is something that's happening over the course of decades. So you can really phase this in over a large capital spend period, also over decades. So it's not just a one-time fix. As it relates to the resiliency or climate mitigation component, is what I think about it. This is an area where I'm very excited to see the commitments that ports are making across the country. You see, for example, the Port of New York and New Jersey and the Port of Houston committing to net zero by 2050. The Port of LA, Long Beach, and San Diego have goals related to zero emission goods movement by 2030 and 2035, and similarly 2045 and 2050 for Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma. And I'm not leaving out, folks, these are just a couple examples. But when you start thinking about that overall approach, it's a combination of mitigation as well as of reducing the impacts of greenhouse gases, as well as trying to control for the implications of those.
Matt, that's an excellent answer, and that would be my answer, Helen. That we are the projects that we are planning. We're planning with a look to the future and climate projections, and that goes for our cities as well. Our city just built a huge new lake walk structure and the amount of armoring that went into that, is reflective of what Matt's talking about. I think there's also, I know it's not what you're talking about, but well, it is in a way. We also need to plan for resiliency as a nation. And so there are going to be the storm events that affect our coastal ports. We've seen it in the Gulf. We've seen it, on the Atlantic coast. And so we also, it's just like a disaster preparedness plan. We need to have that. That's why we need resiliency in using, all of the inland waterways, all of the coastal ports, so we can shift quickly between. And that probably goes to the flow or smart ports concept as well.
Again, thinking of the system as a system and that they're all interrelated. Would Joseph, Darren, would you like to respond?
I'd like to take a shot at that.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned in your introduction the resilience study that we just finished in the last 6 or 8 months through the Transportation Research Board that was dealing with surface transportation, really, waterways as well, but surface transportation in general in the United States. And one of the recommendations that came out of that report is that resilience ought to be a consideration in every major investment decision, whether or not it's about resilience, because every major decision is an opportunity to grow the resilience of the infrastructure that's connected to transportation and to everything else. The other observation I would make is that there's some evidence of this. It's not particularly easy to make long-term and large-scale investments in resilience from the point of view of political decision making, because what you're really asking a political decision maker to do is to take money that she could spend today on a project that delivers benefits for today on a project that might deliver benefits far into the future. And while we ought to be doing that, like we do in our household, where we replace the roof before it starts to leak, or we buy in insurance, it's not particularly easy in a political environment to make those long-term decisions. And there's some examples around, particularly in coastal areas that have suffered severe damage from tropical storms, where it's been very difficult to move ahead with some of these large-scale investments.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Darren, do you want to
Sure.
respond?
Sure. Mention two things. One, within the Port Infrastructure Development Program, the resilience improvements have always been one of the eligible uses. But with this year's program, the statutory language really highlights resilience-oriented improvements as a key, not just eligibility, one of the key goals of the program is to address resilience. I think it's helpful to keep in mind there are different ways of addressing resilience. Sometimes it's a matter of hardening the infrastructure against the events you're talking about. In other cases, you can improve resilience by designing infrastructure that focusing on the recovery side. Once the events happens, how quickly can you bring your facility back into full operation? And there's different ways of doing that. Oftentimes it requires rethinking the way our current facilities are designed. The other point I would just make on addressing climate change, another way ports can play a role is in supporting green energy infrastructure. So within the PIDP, we've seen many grant applications last year, in particular for port projects that would specifically intended to support the development of offshore wind facilities on the East Coast, but also on the West Coast as well. And so I think that's another really important role the ports can play.
Yeah, thank you. Deb, I'd like to ask you a direct question. I mean, we talked about 5 years and everybody talked about that, all this funding, and then in 5 years, you're going to go to a next phase. In 5 years, what will the Port of Duluth be looking for as a priority? If you had to name a couple, what do you think they will be?
Well, I can tell you, because we're implementing starting the summer a Port Infrastructure Development Program grant that we were awarded in 2020. And I know what we're applying for next, and that will be we acquired another terminal, and we'll be seeking to demo the old dilapidated grain elevators and rebuild that dock and bring it be part of our multimodal logistics hub. If we were really lucky, I probably shouldn't say this publicly, we'd be taking over the other half of that dock as well, building a loop track. So anyway, we know where we'd go. It would be building more of the same because there's demand for it, and we are constantly getting inquiries about other new product supply chains that might move here. And it's it's like this. There's several that come up and they incubate for a while. They come back in a slightly different form. Anyway, that's why we build it very flexibly and able to shift between options. But that's what we'd be doing.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, and I'm going to modify the question just a wee bit to concentrate on workforce. Workforce is an absolute part of the infrastructure of the marine transportation system. We're certainly within the CMTS talking about the challenges of recruitment and retention of mariners. But I'd like a perspective, perhaps talking with Dr. Schofield, because you're looking at the transportation sector a little more broadly, and then everybody respond as you would like. Do we have the skills, the numbers, the network of the workforce required to meet the needs of the future?
I think the evidence is right now that we don't have the employees where we need them. Is it a skill thing? I think there are a variety of factors. One of which is the jobs may not be very appealing to people. And I think that's particularly true in the trucking industry. And while this is a discussion about ports, the trucking industry is absolutely critical for moving those boxes away from the ports. So employment in trucking is a serious concern. Is it skill level? I don't think so. I think it's working conditions and pay. And people are expect more from their jobs and want to get them. In the railroad industry, I think it's a different matter. While they're having a difficult time climbing back, the railroad industry, again, important for functioning of the ports, has lost employees in part because of layoffs, because of the Wall Street pressures to reduce operating ratios, which means cutting costs and trying to function with fewer employees. And some of the people in the field have said the railroads went too far with that, and the Surface Transportation Board is hammering on the Class 1 railroads to turn that around. I think there are things we can do to promote some of these jobs, not only to make the jobs better, but to make people, particularly in the Inland Empire, if you will, more aware of the opportunities and to provide the kind of skills training to bring them into those positions.
Thank you. Anybody else care to jump in?
One area I'd like to highlight is probably the need in terms of skills development as it relates to new technologies. So one of the things that we've seen in terms of implementing novel pilot projects related to electrification is the concern that's brought up by union operators about not only the safety of battery electric technologies, but also how to work on them, operate, maintain. And then also the overarching concern that's there about the potential for how electrification automation can oftentimes go hand in glove. And so I think one of the key things in terms of this education of the workforce is understanding that we have to move towards a safer and more efficient goods movement approach. And what that means is that it's a change in the types of jobs that we're doing on a terminal, but in fact, what we're exchanging them for is higher skilled, higher paid or equivalent paid types of jobs that keep the workers safe and increase actually the number of jobs in the future. So I think that's something that's critical as we transition to this new future.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'm going to, there's one more question in here that came from the chat. And I don't know if this is true, but there was a perception that in maritime infrastructure dollars are going to East and Gulf Coast ports. However, Ms. DeLuca mentioned funding that they've received for the port of Duluth. And well, a lot of cargo does come through the West Coast. It certainly comes through East Coast and the Gulf. To Darren, I think, is it your perception, and it may be a little too soon to say, the Import Development Funds applications just came in, and it'll be interesting to see how those funds are distributed. I always thought they were distributed a bit geographically, that there was a pretty good balance. But Darren, what is your response to that? Do you feel that maritime infrastructure dollars are going to the East or Gulf Coast? But I'm assuming federal references to federal maritime infrastructure dollars.
Yeah, I have to look at the specific data. I would say, just looking at the applications we receive, ultimately the selections we make, depend on. We aren't proactively picking the projects. We're reviewing applications that are submitted by the operators of the port infrastructure themselves, and so it could be a function of that. Just we tend to get more applications from those areas, but I know we've certainly seen some really good applications and have funded projects on the West Coast as well. I certainly haven't seen any kind of bias in terms of the internal decision making toward that. We should focus on one area versus another.
I think I'd like to jump in on that. I think there may be other factors that are causing at least a short-term drift in the direction of the East Coast, and the expansion of the locks on the Panama Canal is one of them. I think the East Coast was in a position where there was a need to do a fair amount of catching up to prepare ports for those larger ships, whereas there wasn't that need on the West Coast. So that may be part of the explanation.
Thank you. It does help to define what the dollars are come from and where they're from and what they're about, because there is a difference between the funds that come out of port development funds versus come to deepening to the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're almost out of time. If I could ask each of our panelists, starting with Dr. Schofer, just give short 30-second summary of any last comments you'd like to make, Dr. Schofer.
Really interesting opportunities in this field, and I think people, COVID-19 has helped us pay attention to the ports, and now maybe we need to shine a brighter light on the inland waterway system, because there are opportunities there to steal some freight from some of the surface modes. So it's a bright future, and there's money to work with. And it's just, I think all of our speakers have said the same thing. You need to look ahead 5 years downstream and say, now where's the next tranche of money going to come from? Because there's going to be a need for it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Luca.
But Dr. Schofer, you stole everything I was going to say. So, yeah, I think we should be looking at nationwide at resiliency, using all of our waterways to a greater extent, and trying not to just create more of the same problem that we already had. Like, where are our vulnerabilities and how can we correct those? I think this is also a really great time. I tell all my friends with children that are college age students that if you really want to make a difference in sustainability worldwide, and get involved in the supply chain field, because we're all consumers. We all consume a lot more stuff than we know, acknowledge, or admit, and all of that stuff moves, and it has to move on water, has to move on land to get to us. So there's lots of opportunities in the supply chain and port field, and they're very interesting jobs. So that's a take-home message to any of you listening with college-age kids.
Thank you. My son is in that business. I keep pushing him, saying that's where the money is. But thank you. Dr. Timothy.
A couple of the speakers earlier referenced benefit cost analysis. I'd be remiss, given the prominent role my office plays in that at USDOT under our grant programs. I think one of the key, doing a good benefit cost analysis requires being able to articulate the problem you're trying to solve, and being able to explain how a particular project solves that. Really thinking about what's the value proposition that ports are offering in proposing these infrastructure investment solutions. I think I think some of the highest quality analyses and best projects we've seen have been in applications, have been projects that can really tell that story. And then based on that, that gives you the kind of foundation you need to then be able to go out and quantify those.
Thank you. Dr. Wartian.
For me, I think my key takeaway point for everyone would be, while we are just getting started on the flow of money through the Infrastructure Bill and Jobs Act. And so while you're seeing like the PDEP money and everything else, that money authorizations come through this year, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to prepare for the next 4.5 years of grant applications, and then the next 10 years of implementation. And so if you feel like you're behind, it's not too late to get caught up and started. So I just say, do whatever you can to start today. And there's a lot of your cohorts, different ports and terminals that can help you along.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today, Lucinda Leslie and Chris Connor for their opening remarks. Folks, just please look at the CMTS website at cmts.gov to look for future events and activities and publications of the CMTS. We always welcome your ideas and thoughts at mtsinfo@cmts.gov. With that, please look for this to be recorded and shown on YouTube. And thanks for joining us today. Have a really good week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you.